Let it be Christmas! Little Alan Jackson for your Christmas season here. Welcome. Hope you're having a good day. It's Thursday morning, and it's cold in my room. And if you know third period, you'll be in here, and it will be cold. You'll be writing an essay today, and hopefully you have warm ideas in your head because the floor is freezing. I wanted to finish up the unit with our last section, the Age of Isms here. This is page 9 of the study guide. Hopefully you're coming along well here. The exam, when we take it, really is going to emphasize the French Revolution, but there will be parts on the industrial part that started this unit, and also here on the Age of Isms. So as a general theory, this period of time, 1815 up until 1914, which is the outbreak of World War I, is framed by historians as an age of isms. A lot of different movements and ideas that are clashing against each other. Let's start with industrialism, and one of the offshoots of that, socialism. Industrialization finally comes to the European continent really after the Napoleonic Wars are over. The Napoleonic Wars had kept the European countries occupied and kept them from pursuing industrialization in the same way that the English had for a while. Other factors that limited industrialization on the continent, you also had the English advances, the fact that England was so far ahead of everyone else. It made it difficult for those other countries to compete. If England had better technology, they're not going to give it to you. You're going to have to develop your own and somehow challenge the cheap goods that other places had. Europe also had less entrepreneurs, or at least people who weren't willing to risk as much, let's say, as the English were in order to make gains. Now that makes sense. They're facing stern opposition in the fact that the English are way ahead of everybody else. It's going to be hard to turn a profit. You also have to look at the geographic limitations, the fact that the European continent had a lot more mountains and access to the sea wasn't as easy as it was in England, where you're never more than about 100 miles from the ocean, and that makes for a much easier transportation system. Differences between the British industrialization and the Continental industrialization. Well, because Britain is so far ahead, the governments of Europe are going to try and give their industrial movements a little bit of a push, and they're going to do that by putting through tariffs and subsidies and sponsorships. They're going to be heavily involved. Now, in England, it's the other way. The government really is more hands-off and allows industry to run the business. In Europe, it can't be that way. We need some way of protecting our local industrial product against the cheaper English goods, and a series of government steps are going to be needed to do that. We're also going to see a lot more of the joint stock mentality, whereas the English mentality tended to be big wealth moving big amounts of capital in order to do things. In Europe, you have a lot of smaller individuals. Belgium's big on this, France as well, where small middle-class people, just like the Dutch did a couple hundred years ago, are going to pool their wealth to push industrial gain across the continent. Inevitably, though, this industrial march is going to kick up some dust, and the dust is mainly in the form of what is the effect upon the workers. We read earlier in the unit about the fact that people living in these early industrial cities are going to suffer crowding and poor food conditions and bad sanitation. The life expectancy is going to plummet. Infant mortality is going to rise. It's a much worse lifestyle than living out in the countryside, no matter when it takes place. If we're talking about England in 1750 or France in 1830, it's still going to be miserable conditions. One of the first steps to try and stop that were trade union strikes. Unions were considered to be kind of an illegal idea throughout Europe. Most people did not favor unions. They thought that it was better for individuals to market their talents individually. Now, there is a long tradition of craft guilds and societies in Europe that protected the integrity of groups, but you don't end up with as much of a love of trade unions. And so early unions battled not just these strong industrial capitalists, but also a lot of government laws that limited them. The Combination Acts in Britain is the best example. Those made trade unions illegal. The Luddites, yes. You gotta love once in a while when people say, I just am not going to take this. I am going to fight this with the most interesting of techniques, right? The Luddites are going to go into the factories that they feel are putting them out of work, and they're not going to protest or strike or walk around with a petition. They're going to start breaking stuff. That is the best way to solve problems. I don't know if it is, but there you go. They're going to start whacking the machinery and burning down factories and trying to send their message through that sense. As we move down the study guide, we find the Utopian Socialist. Now, socialism is the idea that economic wealth should be spread out equally throughout the society. As wealth was generated by the Industrial Revolution, a lot of Europeans began to think maybe this isn't the best development. maybe we could take all of our wealth and we could somehow pool it behind everyone. So socialism as a general idea is that spreading out of wealth. Utopian socialism is the specific school of thought popular in the early 19th century that maintains that the best way to make that happen is human cooperation. That eventually the wealthy and the other individuals of society, the workers, let's say, are going to come to an accord where they will agree to share their individual talents. Now, they're called utopian socialists because Karl Marx, who's the father of more modern socialism down the road, thinks of them as being a little bit pie in the sky. How can you think that wealthy people who have gotten rich off of greed and knowing how to cut the corners and knowing how to take advantage are suddenly going to turn into the most charitable creatures ever? It just doesn't make a lot of sense to Marx. And that's why the term utopian socialist isn't a complimentary term. It's a derogatory one. But that's the one we use. Fourier planned these communities where, in essence, we have to move away from society. We're going to need 5,000 acres of land. We're going to put 1,600 or so people onto it. And we are going to perfectly manage the society. Part of that involves rotating jobs to assure that every individual gets a chance at every job. You never get bored. Fourier thought that boredom was the real key to trouble in life. Fourier is going to run these societies. They're not going to be long-term successes, but they are a sign that people are willing to try radical changes to the society in order to succeed. Robert Owen is a man who had a ton of money. He had invested in mills and in cotton and textile production and opened a town, New Lanark in Scotland, where his workers lived, where their kids went to school. His idea basically was that I'm going to share the wealth among my people and it's going to make them work harder. It's a good idea and it works for a while. But in the long run, if your cotton has to include the price of also housing the workers, of educating their kids, of providing meals, eventually you're going to be more expensive than the competition and people are going to buy other goods. This big chart on the backside here is really the heart of this unit. The fight in the 19th century is between the new order on our left on this chart, the liberal order, and the old order, the conservative regime on the right. Liberals believe in things like free speech, the right of an individual to choose their religion, free trade in the economy. The conservatives, on the other hand, would say that a society works best when it is grounded in central principles. And those central principles are shaped around a monarchy, a nobility, and a clergy. If you have those three things, you have stability and you have order. Think about it. In the last 25 years, from 1789 to 1815, we didn't have those things. We hacked away at the nobility and the clergy and the monarchy in France and in other places that the French conquered in Europe, and society spilled into chaos. So the conservative argument is that if we keep society ordered around central, more ancient principles, we're going to have a lot less chaos and bloodshed. John Stuart Mill is a leading liberal. Mill believes in the rights and the liberties of every person to speak freely, to say whatever it is that they want to say as a way of expressing their individuality. Thomas Malthus is another liberal. Malthus focuses more on economics, and his idea is that human beings are inherently not very bright. They're going to always put themselves in a bad situation by having too many children and not enough food. No matter what generation we look at, human beings are going to be making poor decisions. And they're going to produce more and more children, less and less food, and that's going to lead to starvation. The only thing that could save human beings was the occasional war, plague, famine, pestilence, those sorts of things. On the conservative side, we look at guys like Metternich. Now, we've seen Metternich before. Metternich's from Austria, and he believes that society should be organized, again, around these conservative principles, but particularly around conservative political principles. Metternich doesn't want to see revolution all throughout Europe. Revolution is particularly dangerous to a place like Austria because it is a polyglot. There are so many groups within Austria that would like a chance at their own freedom, and if that starts sparking around Europe, we're in for big trouble. Edmund Burke is highly critical of the French Revolution. Burke believes that the French Revolution lost its way when it severely discounted the power of the clergy and the monarchy and the nobles as well. Once those institutions had been thrown out, the revolution had no rudder and therefore was bound to wander in places it shouldn't. Going down the chart on the left-hand side, we have the Greek revolt. The Greeks are allowed, and that's the key term here, allowed to revolt against the Ottoman Empire and earn their independence. Part of it is because Europeans had a soft spot for the Greeks. There's this big romantic movement we'll talk about in a moment that appeals to the old classical idea of Greece, the great ideas of Greece and the democratic foundations of it. And there's also this notion that this is a real grand cause. But keep in mind, at the end of the entire affair, Greece, isn't a democracy. It's a monarchy. So although this is a liberal movement, the conservative powers of Europe, the big powers, the concert of Europe, if you will, Russia, Austria, Prussia, Britain, and France will sign off not on a democracy, but on a relatively conservative form of government. In a more conservative way, the Decembrist movement was a revolt in Russia that attempted to assure Russia went down a more liberal path. To make a long story short, the Decembrists are going to get crushed, and they're crushed not just by the Russians, but by the Austrians, right? Austria has a lot to lose from liberal movements, and so when they need to, they're going to move in and slow those movements down with troops if necessary. That's what happens in this event, in order to make sure that liberal ideas don't flower. Romanticism. As a general sense, Romanticism is a more vibrant, more feeling-based artistic movement and literary movement than we saw with the neoclassical. The neoclassical work was moral. It was not dry. It's still very nice painting, but it is intended to convey a strict, stern message. The Romantic period is much more in line with the liberal and open ideas of the day. It's passionate. The colors are vibrant. It's in motion. It celebrates in many ways the early part of the Industrial Revolution and then later on begins to condemn it. It celebrates the movements of nationalism in various countries and the struggle for individual freedoms. The Romantics love this notion of the individual out against the world, the person who takes on all factors. In a way, then Napoleon is a great romantic figure in that sense. We're also looking at a celebration of our own nation. Goethe. I had a professor in college who always said it that way. Goethe. So we'll say it that way. But the one who looks like Goethe, that one, is writing about Germany and the pride of Germany and the common heritage that the German people have. And that's going to be instrumental in stirring up the nationalism here in the 19th century that leads us to a united Germany later on. Other big movers in this period, Shelley, Caspar David Friedrich, whose paintings we'll look at, as well as Delacroix. In the musical field, we're looking at Beethoven. It's an age of great emotions. It's an age of struggle. Who's going to win? Is the old order going to hold on and keep all of those new ideas in a box? Or is the new order going to emerge from the French Revolution, take over Europe, and take it down a radically different path? It's going to be a fight, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're doing well. Take care.